Until the pandemic came and hit us, I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We'll be looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you very much for joining this CGD event, 6 years later, Achievement, Limitations and the Future of the UN Declaration on Antimicrobial Resistance. So I want to start with some brief remarks. Antimicrobial resistance kills about 1.25 million people a year already. And if you look at those who die with an infection that's resistant, but not necessarily because of the resistance, then that rises to almost 5 million people, making it one of the world's largest killers. It's a particularly big problem in low and middle income countries, like so many things, with 250,000 children under 5 dying in low and middle income countries, and half of these in sub-Saharan Africa. So I should start by saying I'm Anthony McDonnell. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Global Development, and I lead our AMR work on this important area. And I'm happy to moderate this event, and I will introduce the other speakers shortly. COVID has shown us how reliant we are on each other across the world. An infection that starts in Wuhan in China can reach anywhere, or in London, or in any other part of the world. This is true for antimicrobial resistance too. We are all reliant on each other to behave well, and it was for this reason in 2016 all 193 UN member states signed up to the UN Political Declaration on Antimicrobial Resistance. Countries acknowledged that due to antimicrobial resistance, many achievements of the 20th century are being gravely challenged, such as access to good healthcare, improvements in standard of living, and that resistance of bacteria, viral, parasite, and fungal microorganisms to antimicrobial medicines that were previously effective for treatments of infections is mainly due to the inappropriate use of antimicrobial medicines in public health, animals, food, agriculture, and aquaculture sectors. They all agreed that there was a need to protect antibiotics from overuse, but also that there were important questions around the access to services and that innovation was needed to replace failing drugs. And countries across the world agreed to work together to overcome these challenges. 6 years on, we want to evaluate the success of the political declaration and look at whether there are areas for further improvement. I am delighted to be joined today by Hala Audi, Chief Executive of UNGA and former head of the Secretariat for the Antimicrobial Resistance Review, which led a lot of the work in this area and which I also worked on. Ambassador Gomez Chamo, who is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School, and was the ambassador to the UN for Mexico, and he chaired the discussions around the political declaration. Eloise Todd is the executive director and co-founder of the Pandemic Action Network, and Javier Guzman, director of global health policy at the Center for Global Development. And throughout this talk, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have anything that you would like us to discuss, please feel free to reply on YouTube, on LinkedIn, or on Twitter, and we will discuss these questions between ourselves. So I'd like to start by asking Hala, why was the UN General Assembly's declaration in 2016 seen as a priority? And do you think it has achieved its goals as they were set out?
Thanks, Anthony, and hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. So the 2016 side meeting alongside the UN General Assembly in September 2016 was the result of many years of work that had started from the medical establishment long before, for instance, I started my work on AMR in 2014. At the time, as it is the case now, there was no visibly burning platform for AMR. That's one of the problem, right? That it's this silent pandemic, that if you look at the numbers and you take the time to consider the issue in detail, you realize it's one of the major threats to health and current health outcome and future health outcomes everywhere in the world. But it's less visible than a sudden epidemics outbreak. And for instance, I remember at the time, the Ebola outbreak was really what was in the news and in the headlines. And so I would say, Anthony, that what made it is a priority is really the leadership of a group of people that came together and were able to build those alliances and those partnerships that were necessary to build towards a UN event such as the meeting that we had and the commitments that we had in 2016. If it was possible then to bring together that group, it's possible now. There was nothing sort of structural other than the leadership of a few people. So the conditions in the UK and in the EU were favorable with people able to work together, but the EU and the UK would never bring enough commitment to create a meeting at the UN. And so it was really partnering with countries like South Africa, who played a key role in the G20, the leadership of Ambassador Gomez Camacho at the time to really work through the UN system to make it possible and get to the commitments that we had. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It was built, and it can be built again, that kind of momentum. Has it achieved the goals it set out to? It achieved many goals around the increase in push funding, the raised public awareness, including in economic and finance circles. And that's where I think a group like the Central for Global Development is so important, because you're really at the nexus of the disciplines that really matter across public health, economics, finance, and politics. But of course, there's so much more to do, and I think we will get there during our chat today, Anthony, including the need for much more effective pool mechanism to encourage R&D, but also better access and better use through better use of diagnostics. A lot of that is still missing.
Great, thank you very much for that, Hala, and lots of interesting stuff that we can come back to. Ambassador Gomez Macho, what were the political challenges in passing the political declaration, and what kind of trade-offs are needed to be made to gain political consensus when looking at a UN General Assembly political declaration or other international agreements?
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to you all again, all friends here. I wouldn't put that. I'm sorry, I'm repeating I'm listening to myself. I wouldn't put it in terms of trade-offs. Would be different. Health is highly political, has become highly political. Good or bad is irrelevant. It's a reality. And the reason why it's highly is because health has social consequences, economic, political consequences, electoral consequences, etc. So that's fundamentally political. So when you try to build something or in the multilateral system, understand that this is fundamentally political. What is necessary? As some of you will remember, those that participated when we achieved this declaration, what is necessary is common sense. What requires good diplomacy. No, this is not a question of exchanging to achieve something. With health, we should not do that. Sit together, work very hard, learn something that happens very often in these negotiations. Don't understand necessarily these things, which are very common. When we were negotiating, we spent a lot of time understanding and building common solutions. And number two, back to before, clearly we need more. The political declaration, any political declaration survives on its own. It's very important. At the time makes new lines, fair enough, but so what this one, in this case, we need is first champions that keep pushing, maintaining the awareness, and second, as we did when we were negotiating, is to bring together that are relevant here. We need government, we need certainly civil society, the industry, in this of the receipt. Not only is a bad practice, as you mentioned, the antibiotics, but also, as you mentioned, needs to be said, is that the industry is developing new, more. You will correct me, but at least 3 decades ago. So what is happening now, literally going back where we were a century, diseases that were very easy until very recently, small infection become life-threatening. So important that we need industry leadership, we need, and by the way, something that we used it and it worked. We need consumers, because antibiotics is not only over prescription by doctors, used in food. In fact, as far as I remember, is used in food, and the reason why humans get it is food. In our negotiation, we brought to consumer organizations, and they are the day that have the leverage and the power to change, persuade the industry to use less of antibiotics. So there's no way this can be done if these 3-4 sector is not. This is very complex, but we need to, and in the UN, frankly, we need countries doing that.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. I think there was a little bit cut out at times, but I hope that everybody understood you. Hala is nodding her head, so I presume that is the case. Javier, as the ambassador has just laid out, the political declaration was possibly a first step, and we need to build on it. Do you agree that there needs to be greater international coordination around antimicrobial resistance? And if so, what do you think that looks like, or should look like?
Thank you, Anthony, and thanks to the colleagues who are joining me in this panel on this important issue. AMR is a challenge that requires collective action. And that basically means concerted effort, which has two implications, I think. On one hand, no sector, no country can, solve this problem alone. So that is the first point. And the second one is, because it's a problem with a global nature, a lot of countries will not take any bold unilateral decisions simply because they're waiting for other nations to initiate programs and policies. And that basically means that the cross-sectoral multilateral initiatives, the cross-sectoral multilateral approaches are the way to go. This cannot be done by a few countries. This cannot be done in isolation. This needs to be done as a cross-sectoral multilateral initiative. Of course, I think, as we heard from the Ambassador Gomez Camacho, it comes down to the political window. It comes down to, as Hala also said, the commitment from a few countries and from a few people who can drive this forward. And now, we see how there might be another window of opportunity, a window of opportunity that, is linked to the national action plans expiring very soon, about, the 5 years of the AMR Trust Fund about to come to an end, about the 10 years of the WHO Global Action Plan on AMR ending in 2025. And of course, the linkage between AMR and the COVID-19 pandemic and the linkage with pandemic preparedness. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think we have a lot of competing priorities, but that's always the case, right? But now with, war and food prices and inflation and the macroeconomic outlook, it's going to be hard. But clearly, one positive element is the G7 and the G20 have particularly been paying attention to AMR in their declarations. So they've been very good at including, AMR in their commitments. But we need to move from, these high-level commitments to very specific, very implementable policies. And there needs to be, a monitoring framework in place, and there needs to be funding to fund not just their own action plans, but the action plans by all the low and middle income countries. And there needs to be a revival of the AMR Multi-Partner Trust Fund, and there needs to be, a new framework to think about the development of antibiotics. And a lot of these very important measures will be related and are related to the conversations on pandemic preparedness. So I guess all I'm saying is, yes, clearly, this cannot be done by a country. This cannot be done by a sector. It needs to be, collaboration, global collaboration. There needs to be a political window. I think there could be coming in the near future, but it requires very tangible, specific commitments that can be measured and can be tracked over time. Because as Hala said, this is a silent pandemic, and no action basically is not a possibility. Back to you, Anthony. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Javier. And finally, Eloise, What lessons from the success and challenges of international agreements proposed or implemented in other areas of pandemic preparedness can be applied to antimicrobial resistance?
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for having me and Pandemic Action Network on this important panel today. I think what strikes me about the AMR debate and where we are is the amount of parallels between the situation with AMRs and the broader pandemic preparedness, prevention and response situation we find ourselves in. I think while there was that head of steam around 2016 leading to the declaration, it's always tempting to see those things as the output, but they're really just the start. And so I think those global pieces of action need to be seen more by us all collectively as the starting shot in a process, not the kind of results. And therefore, we need to look at, well, what needs to happen from there? And it's investments in advocacy, in CSOs, in partnerships. Hala mentioned the importance of partnerships earlier, and I couldn't agree more. We need to have those national and regional networks that are pushing for this day in, day out, week in, week out, when this is not just high on the agenda of the UN. I think also something that is a challenge for all of us that work in the global health sphere. Within global health, we don't half love our silos. And I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking through the common challenges, the common problems, the common fights that we can take on together. And so while there is an important specificity to the AMR debate, and it's vital that we take on that issue and that problem and the specifics that are needed in that fight, there are some universal issues that we can all club together and work on. For example, financing. And I would say that given that quite a lot of countries actually have developed action plans, but they haven't been financed, that's one of the key pieces in the puzzle that needs to be prioritized. But it's the same everywhere, and with limited ODA, limited budgets, conflicting, compounding crises in the world, this is a common issue that we all face. So at Pandemic Action Network, we are 300 organizations, and the job we try to do there is to find those commonalities and push for the broader financing agenda, for example, but to also make sure that we have specific policies on things like, in our case, pandemic preparedness, in the AMR case, AMR policies. So I think we have to be a lot more creative about that. And in terms of, I can only endorse what Javier said about the importance of a political window and the importance of managing this and pushing this globally. It's great that the G7 and G20 are very enthusiastic about AMRs, but we are entering this different phase, thankfully, where there is a recognition that we really need, if any action is to be truly credible and global, it needs to be at least as strong with MIC countries behind it. And we see some of the different tensions, north-south tensions that we've had in other issues playing out in a slightly different way within the AMR debate. And so I think it's vital that we listen to what countries that in the global south, in LMICs, are wanting in particular. And if we think about something that has been, I hesitate to, in the pandemic preparedness, prevention and response world, we are still working on a host of initiatives that are just up and running. An advocacy success would be, and hopefully a policy and implementation success will be, the new Pandemic Preparedness Fund hosted at the World Bank. That there's been a big push to make sure the governance of that is a lot more global than usual. We have investors and co-investors moving away from that donor-recipient frame. So I think things are moving on in terms of the way that we're approaching international challenges that we can learn from for AMRs. But I do think the real key in terms of advocacy is piling in together and facing those common challenges together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eloise. I just want to say again, if you have any questions or comments on anything any of the 4 panelists have said, please feel free to reply on YouTube or on LinkedIn, or to tweet back at the video, and we will come to them as they come in. So one theme that came across throughout the 4 answers is that it's very important to build political consensus. And Ambassador Gomez Camacho, you talked about the need to have industry and civil society together, and Hala, Javier, and Eloise all talked about different settings where we need to take people with us. I kind of wondered, what is, where do we go from here to build that kind of consensus and create the window of opportunities that Javier talked about? Hala, do you want to come in first?
Happy to. Thanks, Anthony. I think it's really important, this need not to create silos, as Eloise said, and having spent 12 years in government advising finance ministers and the Chancellor in the UK, you cannot understate how much it's not efficient to receive lots and lots and lots of asks for money for various things. And it would be much more efficient for collectively the AMR group to take opportunities to really integrate what we are asking for, which must be very practical and very specific, within larger categories of funding and agendas that are there waiting for us. And sometimes it's easy to want to give, maximum shine a maximum light on the AMR because it's so dear to our heart, and sometimes we don't understand why people don't take it seriously. But it would be much more efficient to actually just integrate it in other areas. And the 3 opportunities that I would see are, first, the funding that there is on pandemic preparedness and response. The creation of CEPI happened at the same time by a very much overlapping group of people who cared about AMR in 2015, 2016. These are the same people who created CEPI, that was a completely central plank to the response to the pandemic that we just lived through. And there's something really important about integrating the AMR asks for funding and different policy mechanism into that work. The second one, to state the obvious, is climate and health. I mean, this is on every government's agenda, and it is completely obvious the link between a climate and a planet that is impacted by climate change and the impact it has on the increase of infectious diseases. I think I saw a number that every year we have an increase of the risk of a new pandemic and new outbreaks of infectious disease that increases by 2% every year. So really important for the AMR lobby if you want to integrate into that. And the third opportunities for partnering and integrating is more of a risk within the AMR family, I would say. And this I lived through when I was working on the review back then. It's that sometimes some of us care more about hospital-acquired infections and what impacts patients in rich countries, and others care more about, the terrible numbers that we see in drug-resistant TB, or even more terrible and less visible until recently, the impact on infant mortality in low and middle-income countries from AMR. And that's really not helpful, I think, to actually finding agreement and getting finance ministries and economic ministries to put money together. It needs to be integrated. And I think, Anthony, in your papers, you've started talking about a grand bargain. And to me, that's exactly what we need to aim for, which is a grand bargain where, the countries that have the money need to invest into pull mechanisms for, access to more products, but there needs to be a bargain that doesn't leave behind communities in countries that have less means to shift the dial on R&D and pharmaceutical innovation, basically.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer, Hala. Is there anything that Hala has said, or indeed that came up in the previous answers, that anyone would like to respond to? Or the next question I have is and maybe this is a good one for you, Ambassador Gomez Camacho. We've seen declarations in the G7, which is obviously just 7 countries, or in the 20 countries in the G20, and then. Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah. I'm sorry, between me and what the. Let me say something.
Please go ahead.
AMR is about, in the end, and public policy never home. You need conditions, circumstances, and the most important, this is political too, society and communities. If society and communities of AMR are or concerned with AMR, know what does that mean? Very difficult that the movement necessary things that have to be done to address it. If I were like yours that are involved in this, I would be spending, if I may say, a lot of time in this to the society, in the community, use it to teach children, because this is what the incentives and the move governments to act upon. And number 2, to bring on board, and I insist on this, the industry needs to be on board. It's a central role in the positive sense and also in the negative. When we did the political declaration, maybe Hala will agree with me because she was there. We found a much more industry, very aware, very willing solutions. Okay, and I think it was it's totally honest. They have not only develop new, of course, antibiotics or to reduce the use in food, but they also have the means to disseminate this in society. Without something as bold, as big, no G7, no G20 assembly will change much. The challenge is how you take these things, these little groups, as important as they are, they can't do much more. Do not go to the ground, and for that you need the society, the mobilizer at the end of the day, the society.
Thanks, Ambassador. And I couldn't agree more on the industry point. What struck me back then when we worked together on the political declaration and the run up to it is first the goodwill in the industry to really find a solution to the problem of antibiotics losing their effectiveness. And what I found was two things. First, for sure, there's the financial pressure on these companies to go and search for the products that will have the higher return on investment for their R&D. And it's a reality that antibiotics at the moment yields a much lower return than many other choices that many of these companies have. And that's the crux of the problem. But while a lot of the, especially the big pharma companies, they couldn't do anything about that pressure. They didn't have a solution to actually, change that. And that's why everybody wants to see a different pricing and model for this. What we found was, within the companies, there are very passionate researchers in infectious diseases, in R&D, who are fighting from within to really keep up the important research on antibiotics and the alternatives that will be useful in the fight against infectious diseases and bacterial diseases. And so on this, it's really vaccines that matter to AMR massively, and that's another touch point with the work that Eloise and many of you at CGD are doing on pandemic preparedness, as well as some other potential alternative products. But what was striking when we did the work in 2016 was how little communication there was between different parts of the industry, and how much they found it helpful to have this movement that was bringing them together. And so what I found, for instance, is that the leaders, and I'm talking really CEO and C-suite level leaders of big pharma companies, often didn't know or meet regularly with the generics manufacturers, didn't know or meet regularly with the diagnostics manufacturer, and that so these were the main groups, plus animal health. And what we did in 2016, building up to the global declaration on AMR from the industry, which was first launched, I think, in Davos in 2015, and then expanded alongside the political declaration at the UN in 2016, was bringing all these companies together to find what was a link between them and what was in their common interest. And it was really interesting to see that, despite all the cynicism that there might be around sort of self-interest, well, there was quite a bit of overlap and win-win solutions that would work for the industry and for patients. And these found themselves in the global declaration on AMR that was signed by the industry in 2016. What matters then is that the accountability and transparency and the work between civil society, countries, politics, and the industry continues. And a mechanism that has been important since then, I think, is a group like the Access to Medicines Foundation, run out of the Netherlands by Jay Iyer and group, or the Medicines Patent Pool, or Unitaid, or other organizations like this, really continuing to shining a light and on which companies are doing what in the industry to really advance this mechanism and the kind of commitment that they put forward in 2016. And to me, that's a really healthy, promising, it's not the end of the story, but it was a really strong step that I think we should nurture at today.
Great, thank you both very much for that. Ambassador, our IT team have asked that maybe if you could remove your headphones, it might make the sound quality a little bit better. And Eloise, I know that you had a comment you wanted to come in on.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about the challenges for AMR. One of the things that's come up repeatedly is about public understanding of the issue and communication more broadly. I think we can hear you, Ambassador. That's great. And just getting down to those basic points, not assuming it's going to be easy to create political will if we have not only the general public, but also significant portions potentially of policy decision makers that don't fully understand the problem in an intuitive way. And so I think that comes down to, again, the importance of investing in those communications pieces, those networks, understanding how those messages can be put forward that take things from the very technical policy environment to the more broadly, widely understood environment, whether that's the general public or decision makers. And again, I do think, if we think about AMRs and think about how the term superbugs is well understood by people, but antimicrobial resistance, not so much. And I think we need, for politicians to act, they always need to feel pressure from, at the end of the day, their bottom line, which is the people that vote for them. So there is that public element I think is incredibly important. And I think sometimes in the health world, in our silos within silos, we forget how much of an alphabet soup it is. We forget how much we speak almost a different language amongst ourselves. And so those pointers, again, there are specifics for every area, but there's also a common narrative that we need to build, which is about global health. It's about the SDGs. It's about development in general, which is that definite advantage we have of investing now, saving money later. And we've still, despite trying that in various ways, despite the fact that the pandemic has shown us what happens when you let something get out of control. And with AMRs, we've got this, as you said, silent pandemic that's going on, costing lives, costing money, costing too much. We need to club together again and make that case for investment in all of these issues and spigots of money that can release the kinds of tens and hundreds of billions we need to resolve these issues without having a sort of competitive approach with multiple replenishments and all the system as we know it right now. So we also need a slightly more longer term strategic view of the finance piece and to take a deep breath and not only think about the next 6 months, but the more strategic frame of the next few years and work together to do that. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And hopefully Ambassador will join us again shortly. So one, I just saw there, Javier, you wanted to build on the kind of the industry side of those comments and how we bring them into the frame.
Well, I guess 2 points just to build on what we just heard. The first one, I think what Eloise said about the importance of involving the global south. Just wanted to say this is extremely important. And we've seen how policymakers in high-income countries think of AMR very differently from policymakers in low and middle-income countries. We did some interviews with key policymakers. We've done some landscaping analysis. And clearly, high-income countries think of AMR as a problem with innovation and stewardship. Stewardship as, we need to, make sure that the world uses antibiotics in the most appropriate manner. Whereas in low-income countries and low and middle-income countries, the question is more about access. So the question is more about why do we talk so much about, stewardship and appropriate use if we're not getting the antibiotics anyway? So I think when we talk about the grand bargain, we're thinking about the roles and responsibilities that each different stakeholder and country would have in this, triangle of innovation, stewardship, or appropriate use and access. So I just wanted to say that. And the second point about industry is I do very much agree that industry is needed and civil society is needed, but I want to say, they've made rational decisions, and this is a problem with the design of the system. So as much as they're willing to do what they want to do and what they feel is good for the world, if the system is not fit for purpose, if the system doesn't reimburse appropriately vis-a-vis other priorities, they will never get into additional work on antimicrobial resistance. So therefore, governments do need to change the system and do need to come up with innovative ways to address the market failure. And I heard you, Hala, saying there's been progress on the push mechanism, so subsidizing the inputs, but clearly that's not enough. And then we need to, see how the countries commit to changing the system to increase, the return investment. So the UK doing it is a great step, but it's just one country. So we want to see the US. We want to see the US, passing the Pasteur Act, and we want to see other countries. And we don't know what to ask low and middle income countries to do. So also research gaps that we are working on to fill. Like, what's the policy action? What's the design that we want to change in low and middle income countries? Thanks, Anthony. Back to you.
Thank you very much. One question I had.
Anthony?
Oh, of course. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Two quick points. One, industry, I totally agree. One of the challenges is the market failure. And we discussed then that we need to be in finding new financing mechanisms to assist the industry in necessary. And I don't think the problem is financing itself, because I agree with Javier. Governments need to find a good way to do it. So that's totally. I understanding completely that develop naturally bigger challenges. I would be careful not to frame the North-South issue as a developing countries issue. It's not about poverty or lack of development. AMR is a challenge that affects equally rich and poor. Of course, the rich have better, but the effect is the same. So rather than framing a suggestion would be to start framing this as a question of shared responsibility, in which every country, rich, poor, developed, less developed, has to be involved, has to be equally responsible in the sense of, responsibility. But of course, each country will do whatever it can do. Those that are richer helping more, etc. But the sense of shared responsibility is critical. And I go back to my involve the society. If societies are not aware, communities are not aware, it's very difficult that will just come from governments. Governments also react, let's put it this way. It's very important that all of you or all of us that are involved in this mobilize the society and communities at large.
Great, thank you very much for that. So antimicrobial resistance is due to come back onto the agenda of the UN General Assembly's high-level meetings in September 2024. And I wondered, do you have any ideas of what you would like to see as part of a future agreement? Do we need an agreement? Should it be legally binding? And anything that we should be doing now to lay the groundwork before a future agreement? I might take you all in turn. Javier, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Anthony. I think, as I was alluding to in the first response, there is a window of opportunity, and you just talked about that window, and that's 2024, and that basically means that we should build the momentum to get there, with not just with the support from the different constituencies and societies at large, but on the other hand, with a clear ask, with something that translates into very specific actions and commitments that, one, are not just about political declarations and high-level commitments, but that do translate into measurable policies. So the measurable I think is extremely important. We've seen, for instance, how the understanding of AMR has changed with the numbers on the burden of disease, the numbers that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. So on being able to measure antimicrobial use, appropriate use, implementation of national action plans, changes in the design of the research and development system for new antibiotics diagnostics, this is going to be, I think, very important. So I guess first I would say build the momentum, get the societies at large or the constituencies to move from, political, rhetorical to actionable, measurable. And 3, look at, what are the key elements that, could actually change the game and help us all to make progress. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Javier. And Hala, what would you like to see kind of happen over the next 2 years and in a future agreement?
I think if I had my dream outcome, it would be really that the markets that are large enough shift the reimbursement policies and the pricing mechanism to really make a difference on research and development for new products that are needed, antibiotics and alternative. And this is really the US, and there's I think a very big stake of whether the Pasteur Act will pass or not. And I do believe that this will move the needle significantly because of the size of the market. If the Pasteur Act, which introduces a new reimbursement mechanism for antibiotics in the US, if it passes, that will be a big step forward. I think the other block that can make a difference and shift that needle is the EU. And I agree with Javier that we really need to go from the political, rhetorical statements to the practical measures that will make a difference. And there's an opportunity there to show the kind of cohesion and cohesiveness that would make a difference at the EU market level, at the level of the EU in terms of pricing. It's very complicated. It's really a dream, but that's what you asked for, Anthony, what we would want to see. So this would be it on pull mechanisms. The other one is more practical, is really to integrate antimicrobial resistance and the need to use vaccines and prevention methods much more to avoid to reduce the unnecessary use of antibiotics later. And I think there's something very important in both the public policy progress that we made during COVID to understanding market failures and in vaccines and the importance of vaccine in terms of public health. So I would like to see the problem of antimicrobial resistance really integrated into that thinking that many governments are doing now. And there's also a potential for technology innovation. So what we saw on mRNA for COVID, if the promise of the speed at which new vaccines can be developed for infectious diseases, if this is going to be delivered over the next 2 years, we need to think really hard about how we use that technology innovation to also help reduce the unnecessary use of antibiotics by using vaccines as a prevention measure.
Thank you very much for that. Ambassador Gomez Camacho, what do you think we should be working towards over the next 2 years? And do you think we should be looking to have binding or non-binding agreements on antimicrobial resistance?
Listen, let me put it this way. Given the present condition and the expected conditions in the next 2 years, that WHO countries would be, I might be wrong, but I don't see this to a discussion like that. For different, number one, because at least me, I don't see global mobilization and awareness on AMR. Number two, I think COVID and the experience just having could work as a sort of double sword, in the sense that on the one hand, the awareness on many health issues, but on the other, it's oxygen that is out there to work on health. Are totally focused on issues around the pandemic change in the near future. So I really don't know. And I would really calibrate our expectations. As said, I think it's important also to say that we should not fall in the sort of trap, which is the illusion of a treaty, in the sense that a treaty, an instrument, or the great solution to the problems we have. And if they are, that sometimes is the case, very often is not the case. Too big friend of binding instruments just for the sake of making them binding. People know when you, let's assume you get the conditions to negotiate a binding instrument. Countries are very tough when it comes to binding instruments. And the end result is the minimum common denominator, work as it should. And then years may take, countries may take years to ratify it, even less useful. No, what I would do is, again, to keep bringing this inside WHO. I think WHO's leader central is critical. We haven't mentioned it, I think, during this conversation. Dr. Tedros, I think, could be very vocal about it. But I again, I wouldn't be an instrument and too dramatic if there isn't one. There's a lot of work, community work, awareness work that can be done now, much more on the industry and working with the industry than thinking in this instrument. If we can get one, absolutely good. If we can't, ways we can keep working.
Thank you for that. And the realism contrasts nicely with the idealism from Hala earlier. Javier had to leave just so he could do a sound check before his next presentation, but he asked me to pass on his apologies. Eloise, what do you think we should be looking to do over the next 2 years as AMR comes back onto the UN's agenda in 2024?
I think this is a great time to talk about it because I think it's never too early to get organized. And so the networks and the thinking needs to happen now, which is why this event is so timely. I think to echo fellow speakers, we need focus for that. So if there were to be a few things that are really, we shine a light on in 2024, what are they? How can we make a future declaration more action oriented and not waste time on the build up and the context and the pages of reference material, which are important, but not the action part. And then I would say, again, thinking more broadly about AMR for all of us, whether we're working on pandemic preparedness, prevention and response as we are, or AMR as you are, thinking about those areas of commonality, working together on financing, because the financing fights that we face, certainly in the near future, affect all of us, and we need to not just trade each other off to get small slices of funding, but to try and think a lot more boldly and ambitiously about where new sources of finance are going to come from for all of our issues. And then I would emphasize that partnership piece, the global aspect of the partnership piece as well, and the need to make sure that we don't have that what's planned for now and beyond looks like a future facing coalition and partnership beyond 2016, even much more global, much more LMIC led. And then finally, the piece on communication, I would just underline again that we need to make sure we're always communicating in a way that makes sense to non-experts and to not take anything for granted. Because if this is going to actually have resonance, just like with pandemic preparedness, outside of the UN halls, then it has to be understood by people on the outside of UN halls. So always with that in mind, that's how we can best learn the best advocacy lessons, build on what happened in 2016 and stride forward more confidently in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. And we have about a minute left, so I will close out the event by first of all saying that it's great to hear so many similar views. I think the ideas that came across that we should be building consensus and bringing in civil society and industry makes sense to me. And we all, I think, probably can think more about what are the best ways to do that over the next 2 years and indeed beyond, because I don't think anyone believes that 2024 will fix the problem of antimicrobial resistance, but like Hala, we can live in hope. I think we probably, you're right, we need focused, clear asks, Eloise, and to take that window of opportunity. And I really like the point about communicating things to the public, because we are going to have to, take people with us in this space if we're going to make action on antimicrobial resistance a reality. So I'll leave you by saying thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to CGD's wonderful events team for all of the work that's gone on behind the scenes. And thanks to Javier, Hala, Eloise, and Ambassador Gomez Camacho for taking the time to share your wonderful views with us. Thank you very much.